There's a reason why I like that introduction. It's because it gives me an opportunity to remind you that the first large-scale digital computer in the United States was a Navy computer operated by a Navy crew during World War II. And recently I've been finding that I have to remind people of that because there's been a tendency on the part of a certain junior service to try and claim credit for those early computers, and they didn't even exist yet. So please remember that it was a Navy computer. And if you're wondering why I kept my cap on, I had a reason for that too. It's because this is my identifier. I hope you all know by now that every record in a computer system must have an identifier. That's so you know where to put it and how to get it again. There's something odd about those identifiers, though. They have to be understood both by the person that originally puts it on the record and the person who later looks at the record. That's where my problem has been. I go wandering around airports and people come up to me and say, "When's the next plane leave for Houston?" I got totally demoted one night in San Francisco. I got off an elevator, and there was a couple in the elevator with me. As I got off, I heard the woman say to her husband, "What was that?" "No, you haven't heard the worst of it." He said, "That was a security guard." So then I went up to Canada to speak at the University of Guelph, and I had to go through immigration at the Toronto airport. So I handed my passport to the immigration officer, and he looked at it and looked at me and said, "What are you?" And I said, "United States Navy." He took a second real hard look at me, and then he said, "You must be the oldest one they've got." Now, there were a lot of things that were pushing me toward worrying about all this future business. We ran the Mark computers all during World War II. I thought you might like to know that the first computer bug is still in existence. We were building Mark II the summer of 1945. It was a hot summer in Cambridge, and naturally, since it was World War II, we were working in a World War I temporary building. Air conditioning wasn't very good, no screens, and Mark II stopped. We finally located the failing relay. It was one of the big signal relays, and inside the relay, beaten to death by the relay contacts, was a moth about this big. So the operator got a pair of tweezers and very carefully fished the moth out of the relay, put it in the logbook, and put Scotch tape over it. And below it he wrote, "First actual bug found." I knew you'd be glad to know that the bug is still in the logbook under the Scotch tape. It's in the museum at the Naval Surface Weapons Center at Dahlgren, Virginia. Now, I've told that story a lot of times. It turned out some people didn't believe me, particularly the American Federation of Information Processing Societies. So they made an expedition to Dahlgren, and sure enough, they found the first bug in the logbook under the Scotch tape. So they took a picture of it, and last year in the July 1981 issue of the Annals of the History of Computers, they published a picture of the first bug. And I think it's rather nice that the Navy is keeping a few of the early artifacts, like the first bug and me and a few other things. However, it finally got to be 1946, and each one of us the war was over. Each one of us had to decide what we were going to do next. Now, up to that time, the Waves had all been reservists. In 46, the Navy offered the opportunity for the Waves to transfer to the regular Navy. So naturally, I applied for transfer to the regular Navy. And I was turned down because I was too old. The cutoff age was 38, and I was 40. And incidentally, it's just as well to be told you're too old when you're 40, because you go through the traumatic experience, and it never bothers you again after that. I really recommend it highly. However, I elected to remain in the reserves. Now, back in those days in the reserves, we had 3 jobs to do: summer training duty, weekly meetings, and take correspondence courses. We had to take correspondence courses according to our designators. I was then an ordnance officer. At present, thanks to the now defunct Bureau of Naval Personnel, it turns out I'm an aeronautical engineer, but I don't worry about that. So I took ordnance courses, and of course the Navy was using up all the old manuals at the end of the war. So I learned all about big guns and gun turrets and everything we were then phasing out of the Navy, though now it may come in handy again, till I ran out of ordnance courses. The only other courses that would credit for my designated were the War College courses. So absolutely terrified, I sent for the first War College course. And they sent me the first problem. I was to fuel a task force at sea in minimum time. And all they told me was how fast the different ships could pump oil and receive oil. And of course I knew nothing about fueling ships at sea. But I had to do something. So I lined up an oiler and a carrier and started pumping from the oiler to the carrier. Perfectly clear that wasn't going to get me minimum time. So I decided they must have given me the rates for some reason. I looked at those, found I could simultaneously pump oiler to carrier and carrier to destroyer. And they'd both be filling up because the rates were different. Now somewhere along the line, somebody'd given me a course in problem solving. And they'd told me to always extend every solution. So I did. I started pumping from the destroyer to a corvette. We still had some then. That was all working beautifully. But that course had also told me I must generalize every solution. So I did. On the other side of the oiler, I pulled up a cruiser and a destroyer and a corvette. I ended up with half the task force, all hitched up with lines, sailing down the middle of the ocean. My problem was returned with a comment, an interesting solution. I decided that wasn't the way you fueled ships at sea. Well, along came the next problem. This time they gave me a squadron of submarines, told me scout the Caribbean minimum time. Well, I knew less about submarines than I did about oilers. So this time I called on my friendly computer to help me, and I used a random walk program for each of the submarines. You should have seen that map. I covered it in minimum time. It was beautiful. Only trouble was I had those submarines cutting across each other. They made U-turns, one little circle up here and came back. An interesting solution. I was even beginning to feel some sympathy for the poor guy at the War College that had to read my solutions. Along came the third one, and that was the important one. I was to make a plan to take an island. Then after I completed my plan, I was to make 2 reviews of it. I was to review my plan in the light of all possible enemy actions, all possible future events. And then I was to review the cost of not carrying out the plan. 2 reviews which are critical to any plan whatsoever, yet I keep finding them left off of our plans for computers. We have a very bad tendency to base our plans for computers on the equipment we have in-house and the things we're doing now, and totally fail to review them in the light of the equipment that will be available and the things that we will be doing. I think the saddest phrase I ever hear in a computer installation is that horrible one, "But we've always done it that way." That's a forbidden phrase in my office to emphasize the fact I keep a clock which operates entirely counterclockwise. Now, the first day people meet it, they can't tell time. By the second day, they discover what used to be 10 of is now 10 after, they can tell time again. Normally, it's not till the third day that they recognize that there was never any reason why clocks should run clockwise. They could just as well have run counterclockwise. There's no reason for the hands to go by the digits. I have another clock that has a pointer and the digits go around on a drum. It tells perfectly good time. Of course, by now I have a digital clock, and my helpful crew gave me an hourglass. But they sit there day in and day out and say, never, never, never in this office say, "But we've always done it that way." Now, when it comes to carousels at airports, I can see a good reason why they run this way. That's because most people are right-handed, and that's the way you grab your bag. I still haven't found out why helicopter rotors go the way they do, but I find it rather interesting that we've always done it this way seems to be so much embedded in things. And it's the most dangerous phrase you can use in a computer installation. So hopefully, I'll give each one of you a very small gift. I will promise you something. If during the next 12 months, any one of you says, "But we've always done it that way," I will instantly materialize beside you and I will haunt you for 24 hours and see if I can get you to think again. And I know it works. I've already had over 70 letters thanking me for haunting people. I'll be there. We've got to accept the new things that are ahead. One of the major difficulties is the difficulty of changing people's minds. I had to give a presentation for the EDP Policy Committee of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all admirals and generals. I had to remind those gentlemen that they've had piles of big reports sitting on their desks that they'd had to read and absorb, big decisions they'd had to make. And they had not had time to keep up with the technology that was changing overnight. And therefore, they were going to have to learn to listen to their juniors. I'm telling all the youngsters, officer and enlisted, and civilian, never, never, never take the first no. There are a certain number of people in business, industry, government, who always say no the first time you suggest something new because they're lazy. And if they say yes, they're going to have to do something about it. But there's another group that are even more dangerous in a way, who always say no the first time you suggest something new or different because they want to see if you believe in it enough to come back and ask again. So never take the first no. Always go back and ask again. As a matter of fact, I take about 4 no's and then I figure out how to get around the guy, but that technique comes with age. I ran into one of these guys during World War II in Buard. After about 2 or 3 suggestions, I noticed he always said no to things the first time. So the next time I went in to suggest something, I said, let's pretend this is the second time I'm presenting this. I said, you always say no the first time. And he looked at me with the funniest expression. I had him over the barrel from then on because I just go and say, this is the 4th time I'm requesting this. Let's just say yes now. So never, never, never take the first no on a new concept. It's terribly important that we listen to our youngsters. Some very interesting things are happening in the Navy. I know one case of a young lieutenant junior grade who went aboard a ship. The Navy thought it was too small to have a computer. He took his own computer aboard. He was an admin. Pretty soon he had all the ship's records in his computer. He was getting all the reports out on time, beautiful, accurate. Everything was just marvelous. When he was transferred, the captain had to buy his computer. I know another case where the commander of a squadron was told to take his squadron out to a carrier. He found that when he did, he would have to leave all his maintenance records in the Naval Air Rework Facility, the NARF. This didn't please him at all. He wanted the maintenance records of his planes with him. So he went out and bought himself an Apple. With the assistance of an ensign and a DP in the NARF, he borrowed, stole, liberated, copied his records from the NARF into his Apple, got a case for it, put it in the space behind his seat, which is supposed to take his suitcase, and flew off to the carrier with all of his maintenance records and a computer with which to keep them up to date. Every commander of every squadron should have that. Somebody said, are you supposed to do that? He said, I didn't ask. I long ago discovered, of course you don't all have the same advantage I have, but I long ago discovered that the best way to get something done was to do it, and if necessary, apologize. It's much easier to apologize. You have no idea, oh gee, I didn't know I couldn't do that. I can turn into the most helpless old female you ever saw.